My narcissist twin sister stole my ID to commit a crime and ruined my life. Now my family hates me. One ordinary Friday evening, I was coming home from work, exhausted and eager to unwind. But when I walked through the door, I was met with a scene that was anything but ordinary. My parents were sitting on the couch, their faces pale and tense. They turned to me, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite identify at the time. Later, I would come to know it as a mix of disbelief, betrayal, and anger. They asked me to sit down, their voices strained and uncharacteristically cold. My twin sister Natalie was there too, standing off to the side with a look of smug satisfaction that made my stomach turn. Natalie and I had always had a tumultuous relationship. She was the outgoing, popular one, always seeking the spotlight, while I was more reserved and content to stay in the background. But this time, it was different. There was a darkness in her eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. Growing up, Natalie had always been the golden child. My parents doted on her, lavishing her with praise and attention. While I was often left in the shadows, whenever Natalie did something wrong, my parents would find a way to excuse her behavior, claiming she was just misunderstood, or that she didn't mean any harm. It didn't matter that I was the one who followed the rules, got good grades, and tried my best to make them proud. Nothing I did was ever enough to outshine Natalie's charm. Over the years, Natalie's behavior became increasingly erratic and troubling. She started hanging out with the wrong crowd, getting into trouble at school, and even experimenting with drugs and alcohol. Whenever she got caught, she would always manage to twist the story to make herself look like the victim. And somehow I would end up taking the blame. Over and over again, until I began to wonder if my parents would ever see Natalie for who she truly was. That Friday evening, my parents sat me down and told me that they had received a call from the police earlier that day. Apparently, someone had used my ID to commit a serious crime. They went on to explain that the police had found my ID at the scene, and I was now the prime suspect. I was stunned. I had no idea what they were talking about. I hadn't lost my ID. It was right there in my wallet. Or so I thought. I pulled out my wallet, my hands trembling. Sure enough, my ID was gone. I tried to explain to my parents that I had no idea how it happened, but they were having none of it. They told me that the evidence was overwhelming, and they couldn't believe I would do something like this. They said I had brought shame upon the family, and they didn't know how they could ever trust me again. Natalie stepped forward, then a look of mock concern on her face. She suggested that maybe I had just forgotten where I had been or what I had done that night. Maybe I was in denial about my actions. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and make her confess that she had somehow orchestrated this, but I had no proof. Over the next few days, my life unraveled. The police were relentless in their questioning. They seemed convinced that I was guilty, no matter how much I protested my innocence. My friends started to distance themselves, whispering behind my back and giving me strange looks. My coworkers were awkward around me, and my boss called me in for a meeting to discuss my future at the company. It was like living in a nightmare, and Natalie was at the center of it all. She would come by the house every day, acting like she was trying to help, but always dropping little hints to our parents that maybe they should be more cautious around me, maybe they should consider sending me to a therapist, or even checking me into a facility for observation. It was driving me insane. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something to clear my name. I started digging into Natalie's life, trying to find anything that could link her to the crime. It wasn't easy. She was always careful, always covering her tracks, but eventually I found a lead. She had been hanging out with a new group of friends, shady characters, with a history of petty crimes and drug use. I confronted one of them, a guy named Jake, who looked like he hadn't slept in days at first. He was reluctant to talk, but after some coaxing and a promise of keeping his name out of it, he admitted that Natalie had been with them the night of the crime and that she had used my ID to get past some security checks. He even showed me a picture on his phone of Natalie holding up my ID, grinning like a maniac. Armed with this evidence, I went to the police. I thought for sure they would take me seriously now, but instead, they treated me like I was grasping at straws. They said the picture could have been doctored, that Jake was not a reliable witness, and that it was still my word against Natalie's. I was devastated. It felt like there was no way out, no way to prove my innocence. My parents were furious when they found out I had gone to the police behind their backs. They said I was just digging myself into a deeper hole and making things worse. Natalie played the victim to perfection, crying and saying she couldn't believe I would try to frame her for something so awful. It was like a twisted game to her, and she was winning. Desperate, I turned to the only other person who might believe me. My best friend, Sarah. She had known me my whole life, and I hoped she would see the truth even if no one else would. Sarah listened patiently as I poured out my story. She didn't say much, just nodded and took notes when I was done. She looked at me with a determined expression and said she would help me. Sarah was a tech whiz. She suggested that we try to find more digital evidence, something that would be harder for the police to ignore. We spent hours combing through Natalie's social media accounts, looking for anything that might link her to the crime or to Jake's group of friends. It was tedious work, but finally we hit the jackpot. We found a series of messages between Natalie and Jake, discussing the details of her ID to avoid suspicion. With this new evidence in hand, we went back to the police this time. They had no choice but to take us seriously. They brought Natalie in for questioning, and under pressure, she cracked. She admitted to everything she had stolen my ID, planned the crime, and set me up to take the fall. It was a moment of vindication, but it was also deeply bittersweet. My parents were horrified when they found out the truth. They apologized, but the damage was already done. They had believed Natalie over me. They had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. It was hard to forgive, and even harder to forget Natalie was arrested and charged with multiple offenses. She would be facing a long time behind bars. But the scars she left on my life were deep. My reputation was in tatters, my relationship strained, and my trust in my family shattered. It would take a long time to rebuild, and even then, things would never be the same. In the end, I realized that sometimes the people closest to you can cause the most pain, but I also learned the importance of fighting for the truth. No matter how hopeless it seems, it was a hard lesson, but one that made me stronger and more determined to never let anyone take advantage of me again. One evening, as I sat in my room replaying the events in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder why Natalie had done this, what had driven her to such extremes. Was it simply jealousy, or was there something deeper, something darker that I had never understood? The next day, I decided to visit her in jail. I needed answers, even if it meant facing her twisted mind one last time. When I arrived, Natalie was sitting in a small visitation room, her hands cuffed to the table. She looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and disdain. "What do you want?" she sneered. "I want to know why," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Why did you do it, Natalia? Why did you ruin my life?" She laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You really don't get it, do you? It was never about you. It was about me proving that I could do whatever I wanted and get away with it. Our whole lives, I've been in your shadow, pretending to be perfect. Was sick of it. I wanted to show everyone that I was smarter, better." "By framing me for your crimes?" I asked incredulously. "By destroying our family?" "Yes," she hissed. "Because I knew they would believe me over you. They always have, always will." Her words cut deep, but they also brought a strange sense of clarity. Natalie had always been a narcissist, always needing to be the center of attention. And this was just her latest and most extreme attempt to assert her dominance. As I left the jail, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I finally understood that Natalie's actions were not a reflection of my worth, but a manifestation of her own deep-seated insecurities and dysfunctions. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I sought therapy to help process the trauma and to find ways to heal from the betrayal. I started reconnecting with friends and explaining what had happened, gradually earning back their trust. My parents were a different story. Our relationship would never be the same, but I was learning to accept that they were flawed people who had made terrible mistakes. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive them, but I was determined not to let their failings define my future. Natalie's trial was a spectacle. The media caught wind of the story of the twin sisters and the twisted tale of betrayal, and it became a sensation in the courtroom. Natalie tried to charm the jury, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. As I watched her being led away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of closure. I had fought for my truth, and despite the pain and the heartache, I had come out the other side stronger. Life after Natalie's imprisonment was a journey of self-discovery. I threw myself into my work and hobbies, finding solace in the things I loved. I made new friends who valued me for who I was not, for the drama that had surrounded my life. One day, while going through old photos, I found a picture of Natalie and me as children. We were smiling, carefree, and happy before the jealousy and bitterness took root. I realized that despite everything, she was still my sister, and a part of me would always love her. But I also knew that I had to protect myself from her toxicity. I set boundaries and made a conscious decision to focus on my well-being. I deserved to be happy, to live a life free from manipulation and deceit. Years passed, and the wounds began to heal. Slowly but surely, I moved on from the trauma and built a life I was proud of. I learned to trust again, to open my heart to those who deserved it.